3553 talks about the need for the sentence imposed to, among other things, promote respect for the law and provide just punishment for the offense.
Yeah.
And isn't that what we're talking about here?
That is what we're talking about. That is what we're talking about. Yes.
Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Hey everybody, Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona. I missed my friend Mark Allenbaugh so much because it's been a while since I've had him with me here in Studio 3553. And so today is the day he's back. And I'd like to say it's a happy occasion, but it's not. It's the 3-year today. We're recording this on March 19th. And it is the 3-year anniversary of the first recorded infection, COVID infection in a BOP facility. So we've been 3 years dealing with COVID at sentencing in the Bureau of Prisons. And so we thought it would be a good idea to check in and see how things are going, because everyone would like us to believe that the pandemic is in the rearview mirror. But I think maybe we're here to tell you something a little bit different. So welcome back, Mark Allenbaugh. How's it going?
Hey, Doug. Well, it's going well, and I appreciate the opportunity to get this information out there, because this is I think it's a very important issue. It's probably going to be central to the continued evolution, not only of the Bureau of Prisons, but even the guidelines. And we'll talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. And then we're going to talk about what we can do, like some action items here,
Yeah.
because this is still a thing, and our people are still reeling from this inside, and there's still a lot of indifference. So we need to break through those walls. So let's talk about what we're dealing with here, and then we'll talk about some solutions. As always, you have prepared some very wonderful visual aids, your slides. For anyone that knows Mark Allenbaugh, you know that he's all about the statistics, and he's about the visuals and the charts. And so if you're listening to this on the audio platforms, you may want to kick on over to the YouTubes and check these slides out. Watch the video version of the podcast. Otherwise, go to the show notes at www.setforsentencing.com. If you go to this episode and click on it, all of these charts will be right there for you to see. Mark, you have shared your screen. What is the first sort of topic that we need to tackle when it comes to 3 years of COVID in the BOP?
I think it's important.
And by the way, I do need to have a cocktail for this. Well, not a cocktail, actually. Today it's tequila. But go ahead. I'll just pour and you talk.
Salute. Well, I think what's important is this: what happened over the last 3 years? How did COVID affect the BOP? What were the trends and what have you? What happened? So what this chart we're looking at is a trend chart that compares the daily inmate population of the Bureau of Prisons compared to the overall number of active infections, not cumulative infections, but active infections day by day, as the BOP reported them, between all inmates within BOP institutions, all the inmates at private institutions, inmates when they did report them from the RRCs, as well as staff. The only thing this does not include are the number of staff that had been infected in private facilities. That number was never reported, only the number of inmates that had been actively infected. So what we see here is we start out very early in the pandemic. When I started charting this or collecting these data was on April 16th, 2020. So less than a month within a month of the first infection, which again was on March 19th. We'd see at that time, the BOP, the total institutional population was at 170,000. And we can see and this happened with out in the real world, we started getting spikes. A bunch of people would get infected, and then prophylactic measures would take place, masks, social distancing, et cetera. BOP started doing that as well. And then the infections would go down. Then we would relax the prophylactic measures. And of course, infections went up. And then what started happening back in 2020, and certainly we could see this big spike here back in early 2022, that's when new variants started to hit. And even with all the prophylactic measures, those just weren't enough, including with the vaccines and what have you. So the infections would just spike like almost overnight. You could see how steep they were. Now, what's really interesting, though, to note about this is, unlike in real life or outside of the institution, outside of the BOP, when there would be spikes, like we would see this in the United States, when there would be spikes, there wouldn't be also a big quick decline in the number of infected. We would see the spike up, and then it would kind of plateau, and then gradually decline. But here, for example, the last big spike in early 2021, it shot up within a few days from almost from a few hundred to over 11,000. And then a few days after that, it dropped from that 11,000, within a couple of weeks to almost nothing. Now, what that indicated was there's something wrong with the way the BOP was recording active infections. There had to be something arbitrary, because what we now know is the BOP never at any time was doing randomized testing. The only thing that the BOP was doing during the pandemic was testing those inmates who were either obviously symptomatic, or those inmates that were experiencing symptoms and chose to self-report. And that was mainly how the BOP found out about inmates that were actively infected, where inmates were self-reporting. But
just your data is only as good as the reporting, not
correct.
The reporting from the BOP and the self-reporting from the inmates. And
Correct.
from what I understand, the inmates don't have an incentive to self-report, because what happens is, once they're identified as having COVID, or maybe even potentially having COVID, what happens? They get thrown into isolation.
Correct.
And so it's akin to solitary confinement, where you're locked down 23 hours a day or more. You don't have the same privileges. You don't have access to phones and showers and everything, recreation and everything else. So my understanding is a lot of inmates were never going to self-report, because they didn't want to end up in that mess of a situation. Right. So the data that we're getting is unreliable on many levels, it sounds like.
That is right. Now, one thing, though, that the BOP did do well, at least at the very beginning, is reduce the number of inmates in the population. They started releasing inmates onto home confinement. We have the two Attorney General Barr memos, as well as the First Step Act, that opened up the criteria, or loosened the criteria for the BOP in terms of when they could transfer an inmate to home confinement. And as we can see here, they started doing that quite significantly back in the second quarter of 2020. You could see that 170,000 took a nosedive within a few months, from 170,000 inmates to now 150,000. But as we could see later in the chart, throughout the progression of the pandemic, the number of inmates started to climb back up again, and it's doing that once again. By the way, I'll explain. You'll see there's a big dip back in early 2022, and in January of 2022, we can see a massive dip in the number of inmates. That actually is kind of an artificial dip. That was a dip primarily in the number of inmates on home confinement or in RRCs, not the number of inmates in institutions. And again, this the BOP population that I'm reporting here is everybody that was in an institution, private prison, or RRC, or on home confinement. So,
and for our novice listeners and who are wondering what's an RRC, that stands for residential re-entry center. It's like a halfway house, essentially.
Right.
So it's not prison, it's not home. It's a little in between.
Right.
Yeah.
So what this chart shows, I mean, we can see the spikes and what have you, but I think really what it really shows is how bad the data collection, how bad the data reporting were during the course of the pandemic, and it still is, and it's gotten worse.
Yeah.
And I'll get to that down the road. But what's so upsetting about this is what happened to inmates. Not only were a lot of them sick and potentially have long COVID, and we're going to talk about that, but a lot of them died. And what this chart shows, and very few people have been reporting this. When a lot of people, I see this quite a bit, where defense counsel or even the government from time to time will report on the number of inmates that have died, and it's only 314 inmates.
Mm-hmm.
But that is a meaningless number without giving it context.
Yeah.
And the way you give it context is, well, what other things do inmates die from? And what this chart shows here is that of the there were 314 inmates that we know of, that the BOP has admitted that they died from COVID-19. 314 over the last 3 years that died from COVID-19, which, by the way, does not include 18 that died in private prisons.
Mm-hmm.
And 7 staff members that also died from COVID-19. This doesn't include
I'm
that.
glad you qualified that by that we know of, because you know damn well that this number is on the low side.
Right.
But go ahead.
And we also know that it's on the low side out, in the outside world too, by the way.
Sure.
At any rate, of this 314, well, let's look at what other causes of death there have been in the BOP. And what I've compared here is the total number of deaths by accident, by homicide, by AIDS, another infectious disease, and by suicide. But these numbers here are over an 18-year period. And so for your viewers that aren't watching the YouTube and just listening, from 2008 through 2018.
No, 2001.
Sorry, 2001, excuse me. 2001 through 2018, through that 18-year period, there were the total number of deaths nationwide in the Bureau of Prisons from accidents was 102. COVID-19 has killed 314 in 3 years, where it took accidents 18 years to kill 102. Homicide, murder, only 182 deaths over 18 years. Again, 314 in 3 years for COVID-19. AIDS, another very serious, deadly infectious disease. Only 167 inmates have died between 2001 and 2018 from AIDS. Again, 314 died in 3 years from COVID. COVID is massively more deadly than even AIDS. And then finally, suicide. I mean, you would think suicide would have to be the deadliest. Not even close. From 2001 through 2018, there were 313, which is actually a significant number. 313 inmates died from suicide.
Yeah.
But again, 314 inmates died from COVID-19 just within 3 years.
In 3 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so to make it just this next chart annualizes all of this data, so we can compare kind of apples to apples here. So if you're talking about 314 in 3 years, you're effectively 314 deaths from COVID-19 is approximately 105 deaths a year from COVID-19. Okay. So again, looking at accidents, if we annualize that over 18 years, remember that number was over 18 years, that's only 6.4 deaths a year from accidents, 11.4 deaths a year from homicide on average. Average annual deaths from AIDS, 10.4. Annual average deaths by suicide, 19.6. COVID, 105. That is just, this, as far as I'm aware, is the deadliest single cause event in the history of the BOP, the almost 100-year history of the BOP. There's never been anything as deadly as COVID to go through the BOP. It just towers over suicide. It towers over AIDS, homicide, accidents. In any given year, there's it's not. I don't report it here, but in any given year, it's about 340 on average. There's about 340 deaths within the BOP. but that's from all causes, mostly natural causes. You know, an inmate dies from diabetes or heart disease or something along those lines, or one of these four. But that's significant if you think there's only before COVID 340 deaths a year from total, and now you're going to have to add on another 105 from COVID.
Yeah,
I mean, that's just insane.
right.
That we know of. That
Yeah.
again, that we know of.
It
And
makes me curious about the suicide, the average death, to see if that's actually gone up over the last 3 years, just because people feel so hopeless and trapped, and like I said, the isolation, the segregation, it messes with your mind.
right.
It's just a bit. Listen, it's just a really, really bad time to be incarcerated. There's no good
Yes.
time. There's no good time to be incarcerated, but people, I guess, people don't really. It's hard for people to kind of comprehend, wrap their head around the reality of what it means to be incarcerated, let alone what it means to be incarcerated during the time of COVID.
Right.
It's been such excruciatingly more punitive for these folks, and
Yes.
some people may be like, well, you know, they did some wrong, so they had to go to jail, and jail's not supposed to be fun. Well, jail's not supposed to kill you.
Right.
Jail's not supposed to fill you with dread of catching a disease, and you know, they are in
That you could have
charge,
for life. You
that
know.
you could have for life,
Right.
long COVID. And, you know, most of the folks in there are nonviolent people. So this is a punishment. This is a punishment that far exceeds whatever the crime is in many, many, if not most cases. But here's the bottom line, and I hope this is a transition to where you're going next. But, you know, these numbers are high. A prisoner is a captive audience. That means the BOP is responsible for their well-being when they're in their care and custody. And when they fall short on their responsibilities, bad things happen. How much of these numbers do you think have to do with the fact that the BOP is not taking care of its inmate population?
I think most of them have to do with the fact that the BOP is not taking care of the inmate population. And I think, by the way, it is almost impossible, based upon what we're going to review here in a minute, that these numbers are as, frankly, low as they are. There is probably many more that have died from COVID-19 that the BOP is classifying as something else. And there's so many inmates right now that are probably suffering from COVID, from long COVID, or are getting reinfected on a daily basis, that the BOP is not even recording any data from. They just don't know what is going on in their facilities.
Yeah.
They have zero clue. And here's in this next, so nobody thinks I'm speaking hyperbolically. We can just look at the BOP's data. This next slide here. What this shows is the number that the BOP reported. This is BOP data. This isn't Mark's data. This is BOP data. The number of pending tests on a daily basis that the BOP was reporting. Now, early on in the pandemic, as we can see, starting in June of 2020, when it took a while for us, as you recall, when the pandemic first started, there were even no tests for it. Nobody knew how to get tests, and there was big panic about getting tests. Finally, we got some tests in the BOP in late May, early June of 2020, and of course, the number of inmates that were testing positive skyrocketed. And we could see that those numbers kept testing and testing and testing all through the end of 2020. But then something curious happened. The number of pending tests started to go down, 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 and which meant that they were testing less and less and less. And if we go back up to this first slide, what's very problematic about that, and just bump back up to the first slide, is they were testing less and less and less. They were finding more and more inmates that had infections. And this goes back to what the prior guy used to say. Don't test. Every time you test, you're going to find more cases. So no testing, no cases. Everything's fine then. But that's basically what the BOP was doing. And then what's so problematic now is back in July or February of 2022, the BOP stopped testing across the board. Essentially, they have been reporting, and I'll put it this way: we have no idea how much testing the BOP is doing, because they have reported exactly 36 pending tests every single day since February of 2022. There is no way possible that they have had exactly 36 pending tests every single day.
What are you implying?
That they're not that the data, excuse my French, is bullshit.
Okay, so somebody's just pushing cut and paste 36 every day just because somebody told them they had to report something, so now they're going to report, unless they're literally just giving, they got 36 tests to give every day, and this is across 50 states and however many BOP facilities, but they're all doing the whole nation. It's exactly 36 every day.
It's exactly 36, yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, well, that sounds legit.
Yeah.
That sounds legit.
So, and so what's very problematic now is we have no idea how, and by the way, I didn't include an analysis or any data on this topic, but vaccines, the vaccination rate. The BOP early on, once vaccines were provided to the BOP, they were doing a pretty good job of reporting how many inmates were receiving the vaccine, although it was a little confusing because you needed 2 doses and it was hard to tell what they meant by, you couldn't really tell if an inmate had received 2 doses or not. They just reported the number of doses that they were administering. What happened, though, as we know, is those initial 2 doses of the vaccine were not enough. We started having to get boosters and what have you. The BOP has never, ever reported on the number of booster vaccines, vaccination boosters that is administered to the inmates, let alone staff. So we have no idea. Nobody has any idea what the vaccination rate is or how effectively vaccinated the inmates are in any particular institution or the BOP nationwide. And that is just appalling. Nobody can say, oh, well, everybody's vaccinated now, everything's fine. Well, you're not doing any testing and you're not reporting on the number of vaccines. So there's no way that anybody could say that. There's no evidence that the BOP is prepared for the next iteration of COVID-19 or the next big pandemic that might come down the pike in the next month or year or what have you. And so what's problematic about that is the BOP now is acting as if the pandemic is over. And this is what this next slide shows. Now, back in April of 2022, the BOP began reporting on the operational levels. It began as assigning operational levels to each of its institutions. One was a minimal operational level and had to do with how much prophylactic measures were being taken at that institution in terms of handing out masks, whether there was any visitation, social distancing, et cetera, all the standard procedures, and how basically how effectively they were enforcing them, or how diligently they were enforcing these prophylactic measures.
Yeah.
So 1 is a minimal, 2 is moderate, and operational 3 is intense, where they're really focusing on keeping the facility as much as they could clean of the virus. What we could see here is back in May, just less than a year ago, most of the institutions were at operational level 3, just less than a year ago. Now, every single institution is at operational level 1, except for one institution, which is at operational level 2. None are at operational level 3. It's basically, we're at a pre-pandemic operational level. And and Doug, from the many cases that we've worked on, we're also aware that the BOP, in terms of masking and whatnot, never gave the inmates N95s or KN95s. They would just distribute wholly ineffective materials such as surgical masks, and just one every couple of months to the inmates, and had to have them wash it and stuff. And I recall reading about so many inmates that they had to use their own T-shirts and stuff as de facto masks because nobody was providing them with anything. It's just,
I don't think there was hand sanitizer and good hygiene soap, all that stuff.
And of course, you can't effectively social distance in in a prison facility. Even if you separate inmates and put them all in, if it was even possible, like the SHU or the special housing units, the specialized housing units, there's still, you have the HVAC system, spreading the germs or spreading the virus throughout the air, because as we know, COVID-19 is an airborne virus.
And of course, I don't know if we've got a slide on this, but you talk a lot about rated capacity. In other words, overcrowding.
Oh, we're getting to that.
Yeah. Okay, because that's part and parcel of social distancing. The more people you're going to cram in there,
right,
the harder it is to distance. But okay, well, I jumped ahead. Keep going.
Okay, no, that's okay. So now what we can see here, and this is a good segue. What I have, what this chart shows, it compares the BOP inmate population to the private prison population. Because one thing that was very odd that the Biden administration decided to do, pretty much at the beginning of the pandemic, or a few months into the beginning of the pandemic, was to shut down all the private prisons. Now, I normally would applaud that, because that was great, because the private prisons have had an enormous amount of problems for years. They were poorly run. They were for-profit enterprises. They were completely mismanaged, and they housed mainly illegal immigrants, those or foreign nationals that had committed an offense, primarily illegal reentry or something along those lines. At any rate, there were 14 facilities at the beginning of the pandemic. The Biden administration decided to phase those out and not renew the contracts with those private facilities. Well, what we could see here is as the number of inmates in private facilities declined, as those facilities closed, as necessarily would happen, they had to be reabsorbed into the BOP's normal population, into the actual BOP institutions that were housing Americans or citizens. And we could see as the population declined for the private prisons, it started to shoot up quite a bit with respect to the BOP institutions. We started out at 143,000 in the BOP institutions back in April 15th, 2020, when there were 16,000, which, by the way, was more than the rated capacity of the private prisons, all told. The total capacity of the private prisons at that time was around 10,000. And so they were about over 50% over capacity, the private facilities. At any rate, we started out at 16,000, and it started to drop quite a bit. And by the way, you can see here on the slide, I have marked January 26, 2021. That's when the Biden administration made a formal announcement that it was going to be shutting down all the private prisons or not renewing their contract. So that obviously has contributed to overcrowding, and it's overcrowding that causes the problem with an airborne virus. The more inmates that you have in a facility, the faster it's going to spread, the more it's going to mutate, the more dangerous it becomes. Not just for the inmates within that facility, but of course the staff that works there, and also for the surrounding community. There have been many studies showing that each prison, whether it's state or federal, basically acts like a little nuclear reactor for churning out the virus, because the virus goes in, spreads a lot in this confined community, and then goes back out through staff that are going home in the evening, or contractors that are coming in to feed the inmates and what have you, or even visitors, or inmates themselves if they're getting transferred somewhere else. So at any rate, now if we look at the, so I jump down here a little bit.
I think that's probably a practice tip. I mean, you do this when we file compassionate release motions based on COVID, and you file a declaration that's breaking down all these statistics. You're not just looking at what's going on inside the particular facility that a client is housed. You're looking at what's going on in the community where they're housed too, and you do all the statistics based on that community too, because they're completely interconnected.
Yes,
so
that's
hopefully
exactly.
Lawyers are looking at this from a 360-degree view, if there's any lawyers still looking at this at all. But we're hoping there are. That's kind of why we're having this conversation.
Right, exactly. Well, hopefully some judges too will be
Yeah,
watching this, and we're
well,
going to
that's
be we'll
to
get to
get the
that.
lawyers to make the judges listen. But
Yes.
yes, and maybe some Congress folks too. But let's keep going.
Exactly. Yeah. So it was kind of it was it I would say the closing of the private prisons was a great thing at the wrong time.
Hmm.
And they could have phased that out a little bit more slowly, while to try to adjust the capacity issue with the BOP institutions. Now, one thing though that the administration did try to do that was good, at least initially, this is what this next slide shows, is part of the First Step Act, or the CARES Act, I think it was, provided for a new form of uh, what they call recidivism reduction training. So as we know, whenever an inmate receives a sentence, generally speaking, they can expect to receive 15% off that sentence. So if they got a 100-month sentence, they would only have to serve about 85 months. That 15% reduction is what's called good conduct time. And that is to provide an incentive to the inmates so they behave themselves, so they can get out a little early. And the BOP also has by statute the authority to transfer inmates before the end of that sentence, before that 85-month period, to home confinement. And usually it was only limited to either no more than 6 months, or no more, I think it was no more than 12 months, or 10% of whatever the total sentence was. That could be used not to reduce the sentence, but get them out of prison earlier and back and onto home confinement, where they would serve the balance of that 85 months. So let's say at 80 months, a particular warden at a particular facility could say, "Okay, Mark, you can leave now. We're going to put you on home confinement. I mean, you're not released. You're still under our custody, but you're going to go serve the last 5 months at home," which is good. What that helps reduce the number of inmates within a facility, and that's a great way. It's probably the most effective way. As a matter of fact, many epidemiologists constantly were harping on state authorities and the feds to reduce the number of prisoners in facilities, because that was pretty much the only effective way to reduce the spread of the virus, was reducing the number of prisoners. So what ended up happening is this recidivism reduction training. These new programs, what they provided was an opportunity for inmates to take anger management classes, or certain types of classes, where every 30 days that they would successfully complete a program, one of these programs, they could get 10 and in some cases 15 days credit towards their home confinement, so they could get out even earlier, or be transferred to home confinement even earlier than they otherwise would have. And that was fantastic, because now they have this incentive to take all these programs that could help them reduce the recidivism when they get out, and they could be transferred to home confinement earlier. Well, the BOP, of course, did not implement that very well, and there was a lot of confusion about how to score these and how to give inmates credit. Finally, there was enough of a cacophony that had been generated by all the actors in the criminal justice system, that by early January 2022, the Biden administration applied these credits en masse to everybody that apparently had credits coming to them. Except what the effect was, though, rather than reducing the number of inmates in prison, what it did was reduce the number of inmates that were on home confinement. They ended up getting basically their sentence reduced effectively, and they didn't have to serve the rest of their time on home confinement, or the number of inmates that were serving in an RRC, or halfway house. And that's what this chart shows. The point simply is that this legislation that was designed to reduce the number of inmates in prison ended up doing just a one-time reduction of inmates that were on home confinement or at an RRC. And that's what the dip here in the orange is. That shows you that big one-time dip in the RRCs and this one-time dip in the home confinement. And it did very little to reduce the number of inmates in actual BOP facilities. We could see a small temporary dip, but that's continued to go up after that, a dip that lasted about a month, and it was just a small dip. And now, unfortunately, we still have less inmates on home confinement and less inmates at RRCs than before that adjustment was made.
Yeah.
And you would think, if you think of this recidivism reduction training, these credits were constantly being calculated and constantly being awarded, you would see the number of inmates on home confinement and going to RRCs slowly increasing, whereas the increase in the BOP population wouldn't be so dramatic. It would probably flatten out, and they could better control the inmate population that way. But they're not even using this vehicle. The BOP is not even using this vehicle that Congress gave it. Certainly, they're not using it effectively from what their own data are saying.
Well, and not for nothing, I was just reading an article by our friend Walt Pablo in Forbes, and talking about how the White House is planning to end the home confinement, the emergency home confinement, on May 11th of this year. That's going to go away too. So I think people are getting out who were vulnerable and had health issues, and they were getting out. Some of them had 5-10 years left on their sentence to serve, but apparently that's coming to an end. And I think they're going to be yanking people back into custody, some of them.
Well, the BOP, yes. So I think it was the office. I can't remember what office it was. It was within the Department of Justice. They had written a memo early in the pandemic that said that once the pandemic was over, that BOP must return all inmates to prison facilities that had transferred to home confinement as a result of the pandemic. Then about a year ago, though, they revised that opinion, and they said the BOP isn't required to, but can on a case-by-case basis. So that's going to raise a whole bunch of litigation about that, about what inmates they're going to pull back and which inmates they aren't going to.
The other interesting thing is for all those folks that have been at home, nice that they're home, but they're still in BOP custody, but they're not programming, so they haven't been able to earn any FSA, First Step Act credits for programming.
Right.
So they could actually be at a disadvantage in that way.
So here's what the big takeaway. I know we've been talking about a lot of stuff for everyone that's been,
we're all over the board.
Point. Yeah, I know, but here's the big problem. Here is the big problem that's coming, that it's already arrived, and it's just going to get worse now that the Biden administration is saying that the pandemic is over and the BOP is relaxing everything. Is this prison population is skyrocketing again. We are now, the BOP has a total rated capacity of 127,393. So if you take the rated capacity of all 189 facilities, add them together, that comes up to 127,393. Actually, maybe a little bit less than that, because some facilities have closed recently. I'm not sure if I've accounted for those, but it's no more than that. That's the rated capacity is no more than that. As of last week, the BOP is reporting just in its facilities. This does not include anybody on home confinement or in an RRC. This is people actually in prison. There's 145,000 there, almost 20,000 more than in their total rated capacity. There's also something called a design capacity that the BOP has calculated as a result of PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act. I won't get into all the details about what that is, but that's a little bit more relaxed capacity standard. That's only 143,001, and the BOP is above that, even that more relaxed capacity standard at 143,000. Where it really gets ugly, and so that, some people might look at that and say, well, it's not that much. Well, let's look at it on an institutional basis, and this is this big busy graph here that we're looking at. What I've done here is since July 30th, 2020, I have tracked every single BOP institution, its population by week, by institution, as a percentage of that institution's rated capacity. And what we can see here, you'll see all these gray, for those that do look at the YouTube video, you'll see tons of these little squiggly gray lines. And each of the squiggly gray lines is a particular institution. If you see a squiggly gray line above that 100% capacity, the red line, there's a red line going across, just a straight line that says 100%. Any of those gray lines above that, that means that they're above their rated capacity. And you can see a lot of those lines are above 150%, and there's more than a few that are above 200%. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Right. As of just a few days ago, as of March 16th, there are now 102 facilities that are over their rated capacity. 102 out of 189 facilities are over their rated capacity. On average, at the beginning of the pandemic, on the average facility was at 94.8% of its rated capacity. Now, you would think with all these prophylactic measures over the last 3 years, and we needed to reduce the prison population, that's the most effective way of controlling the spread of the virus, you would think that average would have gone down.
Yeah.
It's gone up.
Yeah.
It's gone up. It's now at 107%. So on average, any particular facility, a BOP facility on average is at 107% of its rated capacity and growing. That number has, it's not grown a ton, but it's still significant that it's grown over the course of the pandemic. Part of that is a reflection of the closing of the private facilities. Part of that also is there's been 4 BOP facilities that have been closed during the course of the pandemic. And as far as I'm aware, there are no new facilities that are coming online. And that is a big problem because the BOP facilities, or the BOP population, is going to continue to grow. I'm going to jump over to this slide here. What this shows is the number. This is from the Administrative Office of U.S. Courts, and they report on the number of criminal filings by year. And what this chart looks at is the number of criminal filings filed by defendant that have been filed, terminated, or pending by a particular year. And as we can see, while the number of filings have gone down through 2018, actually during the pandemic, they started to go up. And then 2020, they dropped significantly, but now they're on their way back up. The problem is not the number of filings, but it's the pending ones. We can see those actually never dropped. They dropped a little bit before the pandemic, but even during the pandemic, they continue to increase. And probably the most likely explanation for that is that a lot of the pending cases were just kind of tabled by the Department of Justice when they just decided to only go after the most egregious cases. Well, now they have a big backlog of cases, and that's going to start increasing. They're going to process those cases, and then we're going to have more defendants with less beds. This probably will make it's easier to explain this table from the office, again, the Administrative Office of U.S. Courts. We can see that since 2013, that the total number of defendant filings has decreased by 22% since 2013. But since last year, you think that's a big downward trend, but the trend has changed. Since last year, total defendant filings have gone up 9.4%. Immigration offense defendants, and this is pretty significant. Since 2013, filings are down 25% since 2013, since basically 10 years ago. But they are up almost 15% since last year. And that's a big problem. Why? Because we used to house immigration defendants in the private facilities, those 14 private facilities, which do not exist anymore.
Yeah.
So that means there's going to be more defendants going in. And if we could, for those of you, again, who are listening and not watching this, every single drug crime defendants, they're up by 1%, almost 1% since 2021. These are the filings. Firearms and explosive defendants, up 1%. Sex offenders, up 11.8% since last year. Property crime defendants, up 21%. So there may have been a trend downward, as we saw, but really what the trend downward in the number of filings was kind of false. And what it masked something. It masks the fact that we had all these pending cases just sitting there in a backlog. But now DOJ is basically operating in a pre-pandemic status. Now all these new filings are going back up, while there's also a big backlog. So it's going to be a flood of new defendants or new inmates going into a smaller capacity Bureau of Prisons.
Yikes.
Yeah, it's going to be excuse me for saying this, I don't know how else to say it. It's going to be a clusterfuck. And the reason why is, even though we think we're out of the pandemic, we hardly are. And just because President Biden is going to declare the end of the pandemic doesn't care. The virus doesn't care what we think of it. Here is something from the CDC. This shows the weekly number of COVID-19 cases in the United States. And like we saw with respect to the number of active cases in the BOP, there were spikes, and we've all experienced these big spikes. But what's really interesting is we look down here at March, we're about the same level. And you'll have to take my word for it. As of March, we're doing about 150,000 cases a week, and new COVID cases a week. That's where we were in April of 2020, when we were all freaking out. And we were thinking, this is the end, this couldn't be, it was absolutely impossible. Now we're just, this is normal, no one cares. The only reason why is because we've already been through such crazy numbers, but that doesn't, it's okay. It's just, I guess we've been, we're jaded, I guess, if you will. But the problem is, that doesn't help inmates. That doesn't help the fact that we're going to have more deaths, more sickness, and of course we're going to have long COVID, and all these inmates that are sitting in there now, and most of them that are there in the facilities have been infected at least once. And when I say most, I'm talking about 70%, according to the BOP's data. If you can believe the data, it's probably a lot more than that. But let me just.
And you know, I think people say, well, yeah, COVID's going to be a thing and it's going to be with us, but no one's dying at the rates that they used to be dying, and that people, you know, it's not that bad once you get it. Now it's just going to be like, you know, getting sick. And you know, that maybe would be a case to be made for you and me on the outside. It's different on the inside. People have to understand that, because you get sick, you need medical care, you need therapeutics. If I get COVID and I need a therapeutic or whatever, Paxlovid or whatever they're giving out, I'm going to go to my doctor, I'm going to get a prescription and whatever, it's going to be fine. But that's, you know, premised on a concept that's fundamentally flawed, which is the BOP has always been notoriously bad at providing basic medical care. I mean, Google it. This isn't from Doug or Mark. This is from the Office of Inspector, the OIG, and everything else. BOP doesn't know how to do healthcare, period. That means that if you get sick like this on the inside, you're going to have a big problem. That means if you have long COVID and those types of symptoms, they're not going to be treated. They're not going to be dealt with adequately. And that reminds me of, there was a letter that you had sent me, actually, and it was back from July 25th of 2022, and it was from a group of United States senators to the then director of the BOP, Michael Carbajal, who I think got fired. He's not the BOP director anymore, but it was basically saying, what's the deal? What are you guys doing here? How are your therapeutics? How are your testing? How are your vaccinations? How's your supply of, you know, therapeutics, whatever? And they asked for a whole kind of list of information, said, we want to hear back from you and we need an update. And I don't know, what did they ever answer?
Yeah, they did. BOP did respond. I will send you that letter that you could post in the show notes. I can't recall what it said, but it was other than it was very bureaucratic and non-committal.
Well, it was probably, I mean, we'll look at the letter, but it was probably typical, sorry to say, BOP bullshit, which is,
Yeah,
we got this, leave us alone.
yeah,
And we've been dealing with this for years when we have a client with serious medical issues, but COVID aside, say cancer, you name it. And you'd say, Judge, if you send this person to BOP, they're in big trouble because BOP doesn't do medical care. And so they go, well, let's ask BOP about it. And they have a standard form letter that they send. And BOP goes, we have wonderful healthcare facilities. And
yeah,
somebody has cancer, they'll be sent to FCI Butner, where we have an oncology ward. And we're awesome. Leave us alone. And of course, the judges go, okay, that's good enough for me. And meanwhile, we know that we've all had clients. Well, I have had clients that went to BOP and died shortly
yeah.
after getting there, who did have cancer and who didn't get the care that they need. They're not doing their jobs, and their standard response is, oh yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
And the question, I guess, is who's digging deeper, who's holding their feet to the fire. I get this just for stupid stuff. Like, my inmate isn't getting legal mail, and I send an email. What's happening? Oh, we'll get back to you on that. Like, leave us alone. They don't want anybody peeling back the hood and looking at the engine.
Right.
And this is, we're not at action items yet, but this to me is a huge action item. Somebody somewhere needs to shake the tree till the fruit falls out, because somebody they it's not good enough. Their responses to these questions, on any level, but especially for COVID. That's my rant. How far off track are we now? Where are we going?
No. This is good.
Okay. I mean, it's true though. It's really true. And anybody who's ever had a loved one in BOP knows it's like banging your head against a brick wall.
Well, what all these data show us is exactly what you're saying, Doug, is the BOP cannot control, at least for COVID. And I'm sure there's a lot of other stuff like cancer, et cetera, but certainly for COVID, it cannot manage its facilities. And part of it may not be the BOP's fault. They can't control what the president decides to do by closing particular facilities or not funding others and what have you.
They could up their release. They could up their home
but
confinement.
they could exactly. They could up their release.
Their fault. Don't let them off the hook, Mark.
I'm not letting them off the hook. But what you can see is even if they were doing their best, it's impossible to control the spread of this virus.
Yeah.
Especially if they are being tasked with all these inmates that are going to be coming in, this flood of inmates. Mm-hmm. This is what I want everybody to understand, is there's going to be a tsunami of new inmates over the next year that are going to be they're going to have to find beds for them somewhere. And as you and I already know, just in the course of the last year, there were inmates that normally would go to a camp, but they're having to go to a low facility, in some cases a medium, because there's no more room at the camp. Mm-hmm. And so this is happening, quite a bit, and they're having to move inmates all over the place now because there's just no more room at the end. Yeah. But what we're seeing,
and for any lawyer that's listening to this, I hope the lights are going off in your head that these are sentencing arguments. Yes. You have a white collar case, and the judge who's sentencing them may want to be giving them 10 years, but they believe that, well, it's not going to be the worst 10 years of their life because they're going to a camp where they don't even have a fence, and they'll get programming, and they'll get this, and they'll get that. Well, you need to make sure they understand that is not a foregone conclusion.
Correct.
And the numbers matter. And for anybody who's like, okay, Mark, the sky is falling, Chicken Little, Alan Baugh, I would love to. This is our 3-year anniversary. So I am going back in my mind to 3 years ago when I started to see your Facebook post. It was more than 3 years ago. It was the beginning of 2020 when nobody saw this coming in any significant way. Yeah. And you did. Because you were looking at the data, you had your charts, you were posting on Facebook saying, this is going to be bad, buckle up.
Yep.
And I think a lot of your friends and people on Facebook are like, okay, thanks for that. But I doubt it. So when Mark Allenbaugh tells you something's going to happen, you probably ought to listen. You're the E.F.
But
Hutton
that's what I
of
mean.
BOP
This is just,
statistics.
I'm just telling you what the data say. Like back then, just over 3 years ago, the data were telling me, and China and my friends in China were telling me this is going to be bad, and that's what happened. When I'm telling everybody now that with the data, BOP's data, as well as the administrative office, it's going to be bad because we're going to have another flood of inmates, regardless of COVID. Whenever you have institutions that are so over capacity, where you have 102 out of 189 institutions that are over their rated capacities, that's a problem.
Yeah.
You're going to have more violence. You're going to have less availability for programming, less availability for the infirmary when inmates get sick. And there's all sorts of problems, and it's more dangerous for staff. And the BOP is already understaffed, and there's going to be less people that are going to want to work at the BOP if they know that these facilities are just out of control in terms of population.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
well, okay. So I think maybe this is the point where I ask you, what are we supposed to do about this? We've given a couple of tidbits along the way about practice tips, but
right.
what are we supposed to do as lawyers and clients who are listening to this, family who have people in there? Like, what do we do?
Well, one of the things, though, that the commission is doing, and they are looking at this very seriously and effectively, is trying to broaden the criteria for compassionate release. And while compassionate release has not been fully exploited the way it should have been, and I'm talking about prior to COVID, and certainly during COVID, there was a lot of I think that there was a lot of misunderstanding by the courts and perhaps counsel too, but mainly by the courts, of the science behind COVID and what was going on. Where vaccine, okay, vaccine, fine. We're going to deny the motion for compassionate release. Oh, you're not on your deathbed. Oh, motion denied. It doesn't matter if you get COVID and you already have tuberculosis or something like that.
Let me jump in just because I want to give a little context for compassionate release for people who are starting at ground zero, which is it's been a thing for many, many years. It's been a part of the guidelines, but it's been completely underused in just a very, very narrow set of circumstances that compassionate release could ever be used. And it's like maybe you're about to die in prison, so you get compassionate release, so you die outside, or you have extenuating. It's almost never happened. And then COVID came along, the First Step Act came along, and the compassionate release criteria have been expanded some, but it's still very much of a new frontier, and the courts are still grappling with when it applies, how it applies. Does it apply to retroactive changes in the law? Can you get second looks at sentencing? Can you do this? Can you do that? And so the long and short of it is, from our perspective, the floodgates are open. There should be no limit on the kinds of grounds you could raise for compassionate release. Not every court's going to see it our way. But now the Sentencing Commission, who sets the guidelines, are still struggling with the language, and there's some proposed changes to the language, right?
Right. And so that's what we're looking at here. And the commission I had already a public hearing on this, has accepted thousands of letters from the public and judges and counsel, et cetera, about this. They are going to announce their final amendment to the guidelines with respect to compassionate release in about a month. And so what we're looking at here are the proposed amendments that they had hearings on. And these are good. This is a good start, because basically the problem is you identify. So by the way, just compassionate release in a nutshell, it means you get out of prison early. So you might have gotten 20 years, but you have some issue about you or your circumstances that you can go in front of a judge and say, hey, for X, Y, and Z, I think I should be let out now. And the judge, if the judge agrees with you, can let you out now. And that's called compassionate release.
And it's going to be, in almost every case, the same judge that originally sentenced you. So
Correct. Correct.
that always
Correct.
makes it interesting.
Yes. Yes. So, during the pandemic, only about 20% of all the compassionate release motions were being granted, and it was a big crapshoot about how what qualified as compassionate release, because there had not been, as you pointed out, until the pandemic hit. Compassionate release was almost non-existent, maybe a few dozen cases a year, whereas now there's hundreds a week. And so it's taken the law quite a bit. The law is still catching up, and compassionate release is still catching up to what's been going on in the world and what's been going on in the BOP. And so, and one of the problems actually also happened with respect to compassionate release is when the pandemic hit, there was no sentencing commission. And there was a sentencing commission, but they had no commissioners, so they couldn't address it. There was a lot of confusion among the courts about how to apply compassionate release and whether the guidelines even applied to compassionate release, because the guidelines had been written with respect to an old version of compassionate release. And once the pandemic hit, Congress passed a new statute, but there was no commission there to address that statute in terms of the guidelines. And I know this is probably too much inside baseball here, but needless, the point simply is it caused a lot of confusion among the courts. So now as of last year, or several months ago, we now have a commission. We have a full slate of commissioners. Yeah. And one of the first things that they addressed was, okay, let's get this compassionate release working. Let's try to figure out how to make this right, remove the confusion, and also, luckily, expand it, because there's been during the course of the pandemic, people were coming up and arguing not just for health reasons, but other reasons. And one of the big ones was that they were highly susceptible to COVID-19. Let me out before I get sick and die. And that did work quite a bit. And under the old version of compassionate release, prior to the legislation that allowed judges to look at it more expansively, that wouldn't have been available to them. Like I might get something that's going to kill me. That would not give you grounds for compassionate release. But again, this legislature kind of opened that up for judges. They just need guidelines now. So let's get to the point. So what we're looking at here are some of the proposed amendments to 1B 1.13, which is the guideline that addresses compassionate release. And the first one here, I think, is the biggest one, not the biggest one, it's one of the big ones. And it states that the judge, when you're considering a motion for compassionate release, can consider whether the defendant is suffering from a medical condition that requires long-term or specialized medical care, without which the defendant is at risk, not has, but at risk of serious deterioration in health or death that is not being provided in a timely or adequate manner. What that is, the way I interpret that, is long COVID. Now, it could be other things too, but certainly long COVID, which check any epidemiology journal, at least 30% of everybody that's been infected with COVID to date is now suffering from long COVID. Yeah. And it's going to get worse, because we're, as I said before we started, I think we're at the end of the beginning of the pandemic. And now we're going to really start seeing all this long COVID stuff coming in. And we're going to see it in the prisons too, which, most of the inmates have already been infected. So they're going to be suffering from that. So now this is good that the commission is opening this up to judges, and assuming that this passes, which I think.
Let me give a little practicality, a little practice pointer, because we deal with this all the time when we're helping our clients navigate these waters. And that is, how do you prove that the person is suffering from a medical condition that requires long-term specialized care, and that they're not being provided that care in a timely and adequate manner, when you have the BOP who always says, oh, we got it, it's cool, man. Right? And so what you, as a client, an inmate, a family member of an inmate, a lawyer of an inmate, need to understand is that you have to make a record in there. You have to go request specific care. You have to make sure that they're documenting in your medical records. You need to provide your own independent documentation. Send an email through Coralinks to your mom to say, I just saw my doctor today and I'm having these symptoms. It's long COVID, whatever it is, and they're not doing anything for me. And in that way, when you actually get before a judge to litigate these issues, you have some sort of proof because you know what the BOP is going to say. Oh, we got it.
Right.
Because they don't want to ever admit that they're not giving adequate care. And this is a major, major battle that we have to be prepared to fight.
Right.
And I think documentation is probably the best way that we fight it.
Right. And for family members too, what's very important is getting your inmate's medical records from before he or she was incarcerated.
Yeah.
So if there's any history of diabetes or lung disease or heart disease or anything like that, even psychological issues too. This is often overlooked. The CDC has noted that if you suffer from anxiety or have mental illness like depression or something along those lines, those also are what are called comorbidities for COVID-19. In other words, they are factors that can enhance your risk, put you at greater risk for COVID-19.
I'll put this in the show notes, but there's a New York Times article from October of 2021. People with substance abuse, mental health, and schizophrenia spectrum disorders at higher risk for severe COVID-19. Mood disorders, depression, the whole list. We always thought it was like weight or diabetes or things like health things. No, mental health.
Yeah, it's also age too. It's also just age, age alone. And the CDC, by the way, Doug, the CDC has a whole list of all these comorbidities on their website, and they're constantly updating them.
And by the way, I don't think that it was a New York Times article. I'm looking at my notes, and that is just a post from the CDC about the mental health issue. So I'll put that in the show notes as well. So anywho, so compassionate release is one thing we do need to file. We need to start filing these more and more. And the truth is, they're super hard to win. There's a lot of indifference out there. The hope is that when these amendments kick in and that the grounds will be expanded. And I think with that expansion is really just a communication to the courts that we really do want to start implementing this in a meaningful way. This isn't just some little loophole that's been dormant in the guidelines. We need judges to step up and help us do the right thing when it comes to managing our inmate population, right? And so we as lawyers and as clients too, if you don't have a lawyer, hopefully you do, but be aggressive, file them as, get your documents in line and make the argument. The worst case scenario is you lose, but at least you tried. And eventually it's like, we just celebrated the anniversary of Gideon v. Wainwright. How long was it that people were saying, these folks really do need a lawyer who can't afford one, and everyone goes, yeah, sure, okay, fine. And eventually you break through the walls. So compassionate release, one action item. What else? How do we deal with this?
Right. If I could just finish real quick, Doug, on the
there's more.
The new criteria. Yeah. So if we look at subsection D here, that actually is COVID-19. And now what the commission is doing here is codifying COVID-19 as a criteria as a criterion for compassionate release.
Well,
and
wait a minute now. It doesn't say COVID. It says infectious disease. And I feel like you're really selling monkeypox short right now.
Well, it says any infectious disease, but what I mean by COVID, what I refer to COVID is COVID-19 is obviously the impetus. And what the great thing is, the commission recognizes this. And what's really great is the commission recognizes that it could be an ongoing outbreak of an infectious disease. It doesn't have to be an ongoing public health emergency. It can be like what we have right now, but it doesn't have to be. Because what the way it reads is the defendant presents the following circumstances, and there's three criteria. One, the defendant is housed at a correctional facility affected or at risk of being affected by an ongoing outbreak of an infectious disease or an ongoing public health emergency declared by the appropriate federal, state, or local authority. Okay, that's the first criterion. So it just has to be at risk of getting infected by an ongoing outbreak of an infectious disease. Second criteria, the defendant now is at increased risk of suffering severe medical complications or death as a result of exposure to the ongoing outbreak of an infectious disease or the public health emergency. So the defendant doesn't have to be dying or even sick, just at increased risk of suffering severe medical complications. And again, the CDC has a whole list of what would put somebody at risk of increased risk of suffering severe medical complications. And it doesn't necessarily need to be diabetes or heart disease. It could be depression. And you know how many inmates are suffering from depression?
Yeah.
Nearly all of them.
I would think all of them.
Yeah. And then finally,
the number 3 is we're back to we got this. It's all good.
Yeah. Well,
that's the one that bums me out.
Number 3, I think, is the easiest to address by the BOP's own data. It's bullshit. They cannot. And what number 3 says, such risk cannot be mitigated in a timely or adequate manner. And what we have been talking about for the last hour is that the BOP cannot, whether through incompetence or they do not have the tools to do it, cannot mitigate in a timely or adequate manner the spread of an infectious disease at any particular institution, let alone the institutions nationwide. They just do not have the capacity or the manpower to do it. And it's not surprising. They're in the prison business. They're not into the epidemiology business.
Right. And heaven forbid there should be a new pandemic or a new infectious disease outbreak that's not COVID. I guess we don't have to guess about their ability to mitigate in a timely or adequate manner. We just tell the story of what happened from March 19th of 2020 until whenever. We already know. We don't have to guess about it.
COVID isn't over. The pandemic isn't over. It's not. It's far from over. So, and let me just switch to the next page here. Yeah. And this is also interesting.
Sorry, tell me again, when are these supposed to go into effect? They got to go to Congress, right?
Well, they got to go to, so the commission is going to have a final vote in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. And
then they're going to send the final proposed amendments or the final amendments to Congress. On May 1. Okay. And then Congress has until November 1 to either deny them or change them or do nothing. And generally, Congress does nothing. So Congress sits on them for 6 months, and if Congress does nothing, then they become "quote unquote" law. They really become the official guidelines then.
And
on
now,
November 1.
Just to clarify, when you say Congress,
yes,
you talking about the House and the Senate, or just the House, or is it a specific committee within the House? Is it Marjorie Taylor Greene? Like, what are we talking about when we say?
That's a good question. I think it's the and I'm embarrassed to say, Doug, I should know the answer to that, but I do not know.
Okay, yeah, because you were a staff attorney on the Sentencing Commission.
Rub it in.
You're old now. I mean, I understand you're old. It was a long time ago.
Yes, but
yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of interested who the decision makers are on that side of it.
Well, yeah, I think it would have to be the entire Congress. They would have to act to pass a law saying, no, we reject these guidelines. They would have to affirmatively act as a congressional body, not any particular committee or subcommittee. It can't just be the House Judiciary Committee or the Senate Judiciary Committee. The Congress as a whole would have to act and say, no, no to this. And they have in the past, but I think only 3 or 4 times out of the 800 plus amendments that have been made by the commission to the sentencing guidelines since they were created back in 1986. Only 3 or 4 times, and all had to do with mandatory minimum stuff.
Okay.
But so the
Well, I'm
chances.
feeling rather proud of myself that I'm sitting at the genius bar and I've stumped the master. But let's go. We'll figure. I'll get it. I'll figure that. We'll figure that out. We'll get back to
Well,
you on that.
I should have Berman on speed dial here, and you have the answer. So here are just a couple of other criteria or
Yeah.
possible criterion for compassionate release. So let's say there's no medical issue, or there's no big medical issue like long COVID, and let's say there's no infectious disease like COVID or whatever, tuberculosis, herpes, what have you, going around, monkeypox. So there's none of those. Well, what else could there be? Nothing? No. Victim of an assault. The defendant was a victim of sexual assault or physical abuse resulting in serious bodily injury committed by a correctional officer or other employee or contractor of the Bureau of Prisons while in custody. So if an inmate gets assaulted by somebody, and unfortunately this has been happening quite a bit, especially at some of the facilities that are for females, at some of the female facilities like Danbury, they've had a lot of issues with
isn't that why
assaults and stuff.
Carbajal lost his job? Wasn't there a whole scandal about
big
abuse of female? Yeah.
yeah.
So
So
maybe
they
that's his
recognize that.
response to that. Yeah.
Yep. And this last, or that's not the last one, but it's the last big one. And I think this is big and it's huge. Changes in law. The defendant is serving a sentence that is inequitable in light of changes in the law. Now, where this primarily has come from is over the course of the pandemic, many inmates started challenging their mandatory minimum sentences that had changed as a result of changes in the law, where they were no longer, some of the mandatory minimums were imposed consecutively, and they no longer needed to be imposed consecutively. But for whatever reason, that inmate could not take advantage of that change in law. Now, that change of law that wasn't made retroactive to that would have given that inmate an advantage, nonetheless is still inequitable, but for timing, just some timing thing. This inmate is serving 30 years when he otherwise would have only been serving 15 or something like that. That now, if this passes, and I'm pretty sure it will, that now will give an inmate the opportunity to challenge his sentence on compassionate release. This is no longer equitable. And you know what? Another big change in law that might be coming down, just a brief little segue here, and we've talked about this quite a bit, is acquitted conduct.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court right now, as we know, is considering at least 7 petitions that challenge the constitutionality of using acquitted conduct at sentencing.
Yeah.
Now, if the Supreme Court says, no, you can't use that anymore, well, that could affect a number of inmates that are sitting not just in federal prison but in state prison. But at any rate, with respect to compassionate release, inmates that may have been sentenced through the use of acquitted conduct now may be able to go back and challenge that through a compassionate release and say, hey, if it wasn't for this acquitted conduct stuff, I'd be out by now.
Yeah, we did a whole episode about that with Professor Doug Berman of the Ohio State University, and I'll put that in the show notes. But it was about this acquitted conduct, but it was also about whether or not will that extend to relevant conduct and uncharged conduct, because acquitted conduct's a small sliver of the sentencing increases that we're seeing, but relevant conduct and uncharged conduct is a big chunk. And so this may be seismic shift in
this is going to be
seismic. And if this passes, a lot of people, but even little stuff, cocaine crack disparity is going to change. 924C sentencings have changed. What about there's a proposed amendment to lower the criminal history, to reduce criminal history category if you have true zero criminal history. What about that? I mean, there's any number of changes that might get you back in front of a judge on a compassionate release. That is a big one. That is a huge one.
That is a big one. And then finally, there's 3 options for other circumstances. It's just a catch-all. So any one of these circumstances or in combination, can serve as a ground for compassionate release. This basically just allows the courts to consider anything. The judge can consider anything for compassionate release. What should happen here? What are we talking about? What needs to be done? You know what needs to be done, Doug?
What?
It's what I call, and I forgot the term, judicial nullification.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, we know what jury nullification is. Jury nullification happens when you go to trial and obviously the defendant is guilty, but the jury decides nonetheless to acquit the defendant, even though the evidence is there beyond a reasonable doubt, blah, blah, blah. They decide to ignore their charge for a bigger sense of justice. And they are not going to impose a sentence on this defendant for, you know, for whatever reason that they believe is just. And so they nullify, that's called jury nullification. Well, I think it's time for judges to start doing the same thing for the reasons that we've spent the last hour and a half going over. Bureau of Prisons is overcrowded. A tsunami is coming where it's going to become even more overcrowded. They did a horrible job of managing COVID-19 infectious diseases during the course of the pandemic. Yeah. Some of that I will give is not necessarily their problem. I think the Biden administration didn't do them any favors by closing all these facilities as well and not having some backup plan for that.
Yeah.
And also they're not doing, the BOP is doing a horrible job with respect to the tools that the Biden administration or that the Congress did give them with respect to recidivism reduction training and getting more, allowing inmates to be transferred to home confinement earlier than they otherwise would be to reduce the prison population. We house more prisoners in the United States than any other country on earth, both in total number and as on a pro rata basis.
Yeah.
And the Bureau of Prisons, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, is the largest. If it was considered a state, it would be the largest of the 51 states in terms of its the number of inmates it has. And although actually it might be number 2 now behind California, but I'm not sure about that. At any rate, it's one of the biggest. I'll put it this way. And it's well over capacity. Some of its facilities are way over capacity. Some of them are 200% over capacity. And that's just unjust. It's cruel. It is not what our criminal justice system should be.
I'm going to make this even easier for a lawyer. So I do love the concept of judicial nullification, but I also feel like, you know, if we were to argue jury nullification, we'd be thrown out of court because it's really, even though it's completely legitimate that a jury can nullify, we're not allowed to ask a jury to do it.
Right.
And we would never ask a judge to do it, not in that way.
Not
but guess what? But here's the thing. We don't have to. Because what do I say at the beginning of my podcast? Where am I coming from? Studio 3553. And this is, everybody knows why I call this Studio 3553, because that is the operative sentencing statute in federal court. Correct. And it is our best friends. The fucking guidelines are of no use to us. Maybe they'll be better when they change them, but that's not our friends. Our job is to tell the judge why those guidelines do not do justice in a case and look at the 3553 factors. And what is the one of probably the most important? There's several factors. I'm not going to go through them all, but for purposes of our discussion today, the 3553 talks about the need for the sentence imposed to, among other things, promote respect for the law and provide just punishment for the offense.
Yeah.
And isn't that what we're talking about here?
That is what we're talking about. That is what we're talking about. Yes. This
idea, Judge, who I believe, Your Honor, fundamentally wants to do the right thing in a case. I'm not bullshitting. I've been especially in federal court. Yeah. These are thoughtful, intelligent, caring people. And it's our job as the attorney to make sure they understand what's the right thing to do in a case. Right. And 3553 mandates that they consider these things. So is it going to promote respect for the law when you throw somebody into a dysfunctional, dangerous
right prison
it doesn't
it doesn't
that is indifferent and
Right.
incompetent to address their mental and physical health needs?
Right.
No, it's going to promote disrespect. What were you going to say?
Well, what I was going to say, Doug, is if we look at this last slide I have, I shared this with you a long time ago. And what this shows is when I talk about judicial nullification, and you and I are on the same page. What I mean is twofold. One is at sentencing and also at resentencing or compassionate release, when they're considering a compassionate release motion. Before the guidelines, what this chart here we're looking at is the evolution of sanction type from 1980 through 2016. And from 2016 to now, it's not a lot different than it was in 2016.
Yeah.
What this shows is in federal court, what did judges sentence people to? Not in terms of number of months in prison, but the type of sanction that was imposed. And the primary one, the majority sanction from 1980 until the guidelines basically came into effect in 86 was probation or some type of split sentence where it was a little bit of prison and something like home confinement or a halfway house. But that was the default sanction. It wasn't prison. It wasn't prison. And that's the way it actually was in the 70s and 60s and 50s and going all the way back. The default sanction in federal court was probation. We just didn't automatically throw somebody in prison for the heck of it. And that whole system changed. And it didn't change. It changed as a result of the sentencing guidelines, but the court's ability to impose probation has always been there. And courts, like, even if you have committed a $20 million fraud, in theory, you could still get a sentence of probation even to this day, or a very moderate sentence of imprisonment. And anyway, the point simply is this: judges have to start looking at alternatives to incarceration when imposing sentence, and not just as actually as a matter of course, because of the limits of the Bureau of Prisons. And that, I think, is the biggest message here, is reality. The reality of the situation. Maybe in a perfect world, people should be getting prison more often, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world of very, very limited resources, and not only limited resources, but mismanaged ones when it comes to the Bureau of Prisons, either through incompetence or just because they do not have the tools to do the job well.
Yeah.
And that's what we saw. That's what COVID-19 and that's what the pandemic has magnified. And now we are on the cusp of another big problem. And that is more inmates coming into an already overcrowded, mismanaged, understaffed system. And it's time for judges to step up, because the commission isn't doing it quick enough. Congress is ignoring it. And the BOP is just getting worse by the day. And the only branch left to do something about it is the most important one in this regard. And that's judges.
Yeah.
And so they need to start looking at the guidelines with less respect and less deference, and start looking at reality. And how am I going to put somebody in a prison system that's already way overcrowded and getting worse by the day? And if this person's, especially if this person's a first-time nonviolent offender.
Right, exactly. I mean, there's two tracks to this argument. One is they're a first-time nonviolent offender. Do you really need to sentence them to prison? Haven't they been punished enough by being indicted, by the public humiliation, by the money they've spent on their defense, by the by the stress and anxiety of not knowing what's going to happen to them, like by probation or supervision, whatever sanction's going to follow? Okay, you don't need to send somebody to prison in every case, but then you have people that maybe do deserve some time in prison, but yet you have a prison system that's totally incompetent to protect them and provide for them their needs. And maybe it's time for a judge to say, until the BOP can get their shit together, I'm not going to give you this person to send. I'm going to sentence them to house arrest or a halfway house or drug treatment facility or whatever it may be. But here's the takeaway for you, lawyers, clients: tell the story of prison at sentencing. This podcast is called Set for Sentencing. We're here to give you practical advice for sentencing. And most of the time, lawyers just check those boxes like they're a good dad, they have a job, people will miss them, maybe their crime wasn't that serious, whatever. There's a whole other story here that the judges need to understand,
Right.
which is that this is about just punishment. It's right there in 3553. Are all of these things that we've talked about that they're going to be exposed to in the BOP that will exponentially increase the punitive nature of their sentence?
Right.
Is that justice?
No.
Is that really necessary in a case, Judge?
Right.
And the judges have to give that a lot of thought. And the
Yeah.
only way they can do that is if we effectively develop and tell that story at sentencing. We did one of my first episodes early on, because we're almost a year into this podcast. Can you believe that?
Congratulations.
But Maureen Baird was a guest, and the title was Telling the Story of Prison at Sentencing. It wasn't COVID. It was just basically, making sure a lawyer understands what a client's life is going to look like inside. And what it is, if you heard me talk about my 3 R's of sentencing storytelling, this is the second R. It's a relativity story, which means you compare this case to that case. So a person with special needs or something else is going to have a harder time in prison. That's all we're talking about.
Right.
The vulnerabilities, the particular vulnerabilities someone's going to face when they're incarcerated into a system that's completely ill-equipped to deal with whatever needs that they have.
And COVID has done that. COVID, I think, has shined a spotlight on how mismanaged and poorly run, again, whether by incompetence or despite or just not having the tools to do the job. Whatever the reason is, it doesn't matter. The BOP cannot handle all these inmates.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. And judges need to stop using it, because they didn't for a long time. Judges did not impose prison as the default sanction. It was probation, and it's time for judges now. And this is the emergency. This is the national emergency to start using probation as the default sanction whenever they can, or minimizing the amount of imprisonment. It's just it's going nuts.
Yeah. And I will tell you, judges, most of these clients, if you give them the opportunity, they're going to take it and they're going to run with it, and they're not going to let you down. Right. And guess what? If they do, prison's always there.
Right.
You can send them to prison for as long as you want if they mess up on probation. But people are worthy of a second chance. And by the way, for these second look, for these compassionate release, the story of what they went through being an inmate during the time of a pandemic is powerful stuff.
Very powerful. Yes.
They've served time, but they have served the hardest time you can imagine. Completely isolated from friends, family, visitation, privileges, programming.
Yes.
Not to mention if they actually got really seriously sick and had to deal with that. This was a nightmare for them. So where's that story? When are we telling that?
Right. It's not over.
So, okay. So these are our action items. Tell the story of prison at sentencing. File those compassionate release motions, and by God, hold the BOP's feet to the fire. Correct. Make them fulfill their duties to care for the people that they're responsible for the time that they're there. What did we miss? I think we covered a lot.
Yeah, we did. I think we hit all the high points.
But hopefully it's some good stuff that people can take away and actually use. And I would say that if as always, if anybody's interested more in what Mark Allenbaugh is up to, go to www.sentencingstats.com. I guess that's all. So thank you for being here. That's it for today. But before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off on a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.